All right, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's session on findings from the Center for Research Use in Education. The Center for Research Use in Education was created with support from an IES grant in 2015. The mission of the center is to enhance our understanding of the production and consumption of research evidence through large-scale surveys and case studies of exemplary schools and researchers. We're currently in our final year of IES funding, and there's a lot more that will be coming out of our center beyond what we'll present here. Our focus today will be on 4 big picture findings in order to encourage discussion and brainstorming about implications about what educators, policymakers, and practitioners might do to enhance the connections between research and practice. Next, we're going to provide just a brief overview of our study and methods. Those of you that would like more details about our study and case study methods can download the technical and research reports published soon on our website. Next slide, baby. The main survey in our study is called the Survey of Evidence in Education for School-Based Practitioners, or CS for short. It is completed by a sample of nearly 5,000 educators from 155 schools nationwide. Respondents included school administrators, teachers, coaches, interventionists, and anyone else with responsibility for delivering or supervising instruction in participating schools. Within the large-scale survey of evidence use in education, we asked school-based practitioners to frame their survey responses around a school or classroom-based problem they faced. We then asked respondents whether they used articles, reports, books, or summaries based on external research or program evaluation to inform their decision about how to address the problem. If they reported that they did use a resource based on external research or program evaluation, we used an open-ended survey question to ask educators to name the resource they used. We use these resources as our starting point and start to track them back to their roots in educational research by interviewing the individuals who used, shared, or developed the resource. Recall that one portion of the CS survey measured schools' depth of use, which we will detail in an upcoming slide. Several schools with the highest depth of use scores were invited to participate in case studies. In total, 4 schools participated. Principals at each school were interviewed first and asked to identify other key individuals to contact for interviews. In total, 7 school-level administrators, 7 classroom teachers, and 2 district-level administrators were interviewed. Those of you who would like more detail on our methods and to see our survey instruments can contact us for pre-release copies of our technical report, which is currently under review. So now, on to some of the key findings from our study, which will serve as a springboard for today's interactive discussion. Our first key finding is that educators tend to rely far more often on local data and research from their own school or district as opposed to external research. And when external research is used, it is very often accompanied by local data and research. This figure shows the relative influence of different forms of evidence on organization-wide decisions in schools. Topping the chart is informal data, with formal analyses of local data just 3 spots below that, which is no surprise given what we know about schools' reliance on their own data. Local research conducted by school or district staff is also influential in a substantial number of decisions. However, external research is second from the bottom and appears to be far less likely to influence decisions than local data and local research. Lastly, we see that advice from practitioners is also influential, but certainly not more influential than analyses of local data. While these results may come as no surprise to many, there are mechanisms at play here that warrant exploring and perhaps even reimagining how we think about research use. And so I'm now going to hand this off to Liz Farley-Ripple, who will present some particularly relevant data from our case studies.
Thanks, Henry. I'm excited to share some of the work that comes from our case studies of deep use schools. So in these schools, educators referred to research as inclusive of many kinds of information. Some of that was consistent with the types of research prioritized under NCLB or ESSA, and that was demonstrated with comments like using science or wanting to see numbers or proof. Educators also referred to research as inclusive of frameworks that shape their action. But it also included local use of data and local research. In fact, local data was the most frequently cited kind of evidence that educators used to describe improvement efforts. That included, of course, assessment data, but also SEL data, attendance, student work, teacher level student performance data, and cost. Data captured comparisons to other schools, locally or even nationally. And when data were analyzed, they were sometimes analyzed by educators themselves or generated through reports from data systems. In the next slide, I'm going to share a little bit about what we might consider local research. So educators often describe research as gathering or analyzing data for improvement decisions. In this way, research wasn't just a kind of information, but also the process for generating knowledge from multiple different sources. So for example, a teacher from one of our schools explained, our biggest place we use research is really the student data, though, more than anything. We do our own research studies so much in here. And another superintendent referenced how they piloted a curriculum before making a decision. So these uses of data constitute local research rather than what we think of as the normative external research that we're hoping to see schools use. But it's really important in understanding our discourse about evidence-based decision-making. So with that in mind, we jump back to the survey data very quickly. So in this slide, we show that among the decisions that were informed by research, and keep in mind that's a relatively small proportion, we see that most often the use of external research was coupled with variations on local data use, local research, local data analysis, or a combination thereof. So this connection between research and data becomes really important in thinking about how we can strengthen the role of research in schools. So in our case studies, this relationship between research and data plays out in a number of ways. So in these slides, I'm going to share some of those connections. First, in this quote, you'll see that local data can inform research use. And so we see how educators learn about their needs and challenges for which they seek out research or evidence-based programs to address those needs. But another way this works is when research drives data use. In this example, we see a school that engaged in a book study, which ultimately shaped how they thought about their data and what they did with their data moving forward. So this, directionality between research and data is flexible. And in our last example, we see integrated use between research and data. Here, the school selected Panorama, which many of you might be familiar with, which was selected because it had a lot of research behind it, I should say. And then that research-based tool itself generates data that they use to inform improvement. So we actually see these really interesting connections between research and data in some of these cases. So it's time to turn to our first interactive part of our session here. Building from this first key finding, we want to pose the following question to our group. Now we're going to offer you a Jamboard. I'm going to drop it right in here into the chat for you to contribute your ideas or thoughts about this question while I turn it over to our esteemed colleague, Norma Ming, to take up our discussion here.
Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you very much to the whole research team for inviting me to participate in this discussion. So just to make it clear, I'm not on the research team. I am not funded by IES. I happen to sit in a research office in San Francisco Unified School District, where we are always thinking about the relationship between research and data. And so while all of you in the audience take your time to add comments to this Jamboard, I thought I would start off by asking the researchers to reflect a little bit more, because it seems like the kinds of research that you're describing here could be thought of in different categories. So some of it is descriptive research, just characterizing the current conditions. Some of it might be more prescriptive research, which comments on the relationships, the causal relationships between an action that somebody might take and an outcome that results. And especially in the case of Panorama, some of that research that is being used is about the measurements. And so that's measurements that's used in research that might inform the data that people are collecting in districts. So I'm curious, given what you've been studying, your observations, do you see any kind of relationship between the type of research that people are using and the conditions under which they're more likely to be using them?
So I'll take a first stab at responding to that. I think that if you consider analyses of local data and formal analysis of school or district data, that actually is probably first and foremost the primary way in which educators are using empirical evidence to inform decisions. Now, the question of whether or not the analyses they're doing are appropriately sophisticated for the types of questions they're asking and the decisions that they're making. That's something that we're not able to shed a whole lot of light on. What we can see in our data is that there's a lot of, there are many instances in which folks are analyzing data for the purposes of understanding whether or not one strategy worked better than another, right? So they are claiming that that's going on. But they're also saying that most of those analyses involve just descriptive statistics. So it's just comparing, say, proficiency rates across subgroups. Now, that said, when educators are citing external sources, they're citing external research, they tend to cite things that are not first and foremost academic journal articles, but things that are research-based, but have been repackaged and marketed directly to educators. We see them using books, we see them using PD materials, and particular programs that claim to be evidence-based. And it varies quite dramatically across individuals how familiar they are with that evidence base and how confident they are that they're actually able to assess whether or not that evidence base holds water. And so there still ends up being this really big divide between the research and the practice communities, but that the practice communities are very hungry for the kinds of evidence that tell them what works better than what. Anybody else want to add to that?
You know me, I'll always jump in. So I also think one of the ways that the kind of research and the kind of decision play out in terms of their relationship has to do with how distinct or unique practitioners, particularly in our case studies I'm thinking about, see the relevance of their specific context, right? And so thinking about how valuable local data is to identifying, need, challenges, solutions, generating their own versus external data. So I think there is a little bit of that, generalize a bit, or what I'd like to refer to a little bit differently is sort of compatibility, right? Whether the local data or research are most compatible to the kinds of decisions and activities that they're engaging in as part of their improvement process. And I know there's been a larger conversation about sort of the value of internal validity, value of external validity, but I want to sort of throw out there in this conversation the idea of sort of contextual relevance, that the term compatibility might be one way of capturing that. So I'll be quiet now because there's some really interesting ideas coming up on this Jamboard.
Yeah, there's definitely a cluster emerging about relevance or compatibility. And a lot of that is about seeing the relationship to the data that people are interested in, involving them in the questions. I think there's perhaps a little bit more that could be explored about what people mean by relevance and compatibility. There's another cluster here about the capacity for using data. Maybe this would be a good time to invite you to say a little bit more. How might you define compatibility?
Well, personally, I think that there's that old adage that all politics is local. I think the relevance of research is also directly related to how local it is. And so you can imagine situations where the vast majority of schools and districts are sort of operating on their own to try to make sense of their own data. But there are many instances across the country, typically in larger districts like San Francisco Unified, where there's actually engagement with external partners. And so there's this increase in capacity to conduct research using local data, either through a research practice partnership or relationships with external researchers. And personally, I'd like to see things like that begin to scale up a bit. I don't necessarily think that this is a problem that's going to scale very quickly. I think it's going to, if it does scale, it's going to scale in ways that would require very different structures than what we have today. In other words, we're not going to have like every single school and district engaging a researcher from a university. It's just, we just don't have enough researchers. But I could see a situation where the federal government would say, look, we're going to subsidize every school district's hiring of a director of research, because the vast majority of schools and school districts do not have a research office at this point. And so there's a dearth of capacity to actually engage with and critically evaluate research evidence when it's presented. One of the questions in our survey asked educators how confident they felt in evaluating the credibility of research evidence presented by a vendor versus whether or not it's just a good marketing spiel. And the vast majority of educators said, I'm either not confident at all or only somewhat confident in my ability to critique that. And so what ends up happening is the vendors that are successful in getting their products and interventions into schools tend to be those that have the best marketing strategies.
Well, I'm very much in support of the idea of having research offices in all districts, just because otherwise people don't have the time or the resources to explore the relationship between data and research. I'm so sorry, I forgot to turn on my timer, so I don't know how much time we have left in this section, but if we do have time for a little bit more, I'm wondering about how you might encourage asking better questions, both of the data and of the research. Because otherwise people can spend a lot of time spinning in circles, exploring things that don't necessarily lead to useful information.
Are you suggesting that the researchers should ask better questions, that practitioners should ask better questions, or everybody's got to get together to ask better questions?
Both?
Okay.
All of the above.
Yeah, it's probably all of the above.
But not just that they all have to get together to ask better questions, but there might be certain ways in which they get together to ask better questions.
Yeah.
Well, I know many of the folks on this attending this session are actually doing really excellent work in collaboration and partnership. So I'm sure there are some really interesting ideas and experiences and models that we could collectively put together. So I invite folks to add those as little Post-its to our Jamboard. And we can perhaps revisit this at the end when we have additional time for Q&A. But I think I'm going to say that it might be time to move on. Like Norma, I haven't set my time.
I'm going to add one little thing. I'm going to put it in the Jamboard later, but I would say that one of the things that researchers could do is stop thinking about schools and districts as sites in which to produce or conduct your research. They should be partners in conducting the research. And I think a lot of folks that are funded by IES already have that mindset, but many do not. And once you take that perspective, it really changes the nature of the research that you do, because you don't walk in the door thinking, this is the question I want to answer. It's really a matter of how can we work together to answer a question that's really important in that context. Okay, so it's now time to turn to our second key finding, which is that engagement with external research varies substantially within and across schools. And this variability reflects different levels of individual and organizational capacity to use research. So recall from our conceptual framework that depth of use was broken down into 6 subdimensions. And here we've broken the evidence dimension a bit further to distinguish between external research, local research, and local data analysis. The main goal of our practitioner survey was to develop and validate a measure of depth of use of research covering these dimensions. The next few slides highlight key results behind key finding number 2, focused on schools' variability in and capacity to use research. So here are some histograms of school-level scores on the 8 subdimensions of depth of use as measured by our survey. Most dimensions show considerable variability across schools, but the use of local research and local data analysis is clearly more prevalent than use of external research. Relatedly, direct searches for research appear to be rare. In the bottom half, you see that decision processes tend to involve multiple groups of constituents, and that those people interpreting evidence sought to ensure that it was high quality, relevant, and understandable. And lastly, empirical evidence, including external research as well as local research and analyses, came to bear on the majority of decisions reported and at multiple stages during the decision process. Here are some radar plots for 2 example schools. One is low on our depth of use scale, and the other scores relatively high. The dimensions of depth of use were positively correlated between 0.40 and 0.70, suggesting a degree of consistency across dimensions and support for an overall depth of use scale. We calculated Cronbach's alpha for the total score, and that overall reliability was 0.75. Across our full sample of about 150 participating schools, reliance on local data and research was far more prevalent than engagement with external research. But these school-level radar plots varied substantially in terms of both size and shape, which suggests that profiles of research may be idiosyncratic and context-specific. In other words, research use can look quite different in different schools and districts. And naturally, this begs the question of how does research use actually play out in schools with high depth of use scores? And so I'll turn it over to Katie Tilley, who will provide some insights from our case studies.
Thanks, Henry. So we learned a lot about research use through our case studies of 4 deep use schools. And it's important to note that case studies were focused on school level practices rather than on individuals. One of the biggest takeaways from this work is that even in schools identified as deep users of research, there is not one single model of use, and engagement looks different across organizations and individuals. In some schools in our case studies, research and research-based materials tend to filter down through levels of the organization to reach the classroom level teachers. And this model of research use seems to be appreciated by educators in those schools who view themselves as implementers of research. As one teacher explained, in my mind, we count on people from the district and our school administration to know the most about research, but we're going to implement it. We're the ones, okay, you told me to do this, I'm going to do it. As demonstrated by the quotes on the slide, educators have trust in these experts, and they may actually prefer this model due to their limited bandwidth. In addition to this sort of top-down model of research use at the system level, there are also situations where we see key individuals seem to be influential in fostering the culture of research use. For example, in one case, there was a district superintendent who was very improvement focused and drove research-based changes like the implementation of PLCs and research-based frameworks. In another case, all of the interviewees across all interviews mention a pair of external consultants that had been hired by the school to provide ongoing professional development and support. In discussions about locating and using external research, these consultants were consistently mentioned as important brokers. Next. In some cases, engagement with research and evidence is expected by members at all levels of the school. So as exemplified by the quote on the slide, often in problem solving or decision-making processes, committees are formed or existing committees are tapped to go out and collect the relevant information to inform a decision and make a recommendation. In this quote from a principal regarding the adoption of a new ELA resource, expectations regarding evidence to support adoption are spelled out. In addition to these sorts of formalized processes for engaging with research and decision-making, some cases provided descriptions of independent engagement with research by educators. For example, one school ended up engaging in a book study based on a teacher bringing forward and suggesting a particular book called Other People's Children. And another, kindergarten teachers approached their principal with research on the importance of play and requested more recess for their students. So clearly, capacity to engage with research evidence is a function of both organizational and individual factors. And in the next few slides, we'll discuss individual capacity to critically consume research, capacity to connect with sources of education research, and capacity within organizational routines. So on the topic of individual capacity, educators completing our survey reported their perceived capacity to critically evaluate research along several dimensions. For example, whether they're confident in their ability to assess if the sample size was adequate or whether the researcher used appropriate statistical analyses. As you can see in this figure, the vast majority of educators fall within the range between not at all and somewhat confident. However, there are a number of individuals who fall in the mostly to very confident range. And in fact, when looking at this from an organizational perspective, more than 90% of our schools in our sample had at least one respondent who has scored in the top half of this scale. These individuals were not necessarily in formal leadership positions, though, in their schools, suggesting potentially untapped but existing capacity to critically engage with external research. Our instrument also included a social network survey in which we asked educators to share the individuals, organizations, and media sources that they use to connect with research. Not surprisingly, about half of the resources were local, for example, other teachers, leaders, district staff, and very few were direct connections to research like research organizations, peer-reviewed journals, or professors or research databases. If we aggregate teachers' networks, go back. If we aggregate teachers' networks for connecting research at the school level, it gives us another perspective on organizational capacity, that is, schools' access to research. So here we've illustrated at the school level the proportion of ties to different kinds of resources that facilitate access to research, split into 3 groups by whether the connections to research are direct versus indirect. You can see schools differed widely in the proximity of sources of research they turn to, with most connections to research involving local brokers and intermediary organizations. The nature of these connections for any one school is likely to shape the quality and availability of information that moves into that school. Our case studies also showed that in deep use schools, there were often formal structures that served as valuable supports for engaging in research use. Interestingly, these structures are quite prevalent in our full sample of schools, but they may not be specifically geared towards research use. Also, in contrast to school improvement structures, which were largely school-based and school-initiated, research use specific structures were often facilitated by the district. In case study districts, district leaders supported research use by mobilizing their expertise directly to school through coaches, for example, hosting district-wide PD that engaged research or focused on research-based practices, engaging consultants or speakers to bring in research-based ideas, creating or providing access to an online library of resources, or supporting technology platforms that facilitated collecting and sharing information like Panorama, SharePoint, and Qualtrics. So one of the things we wanted to point out about our deep use case studies is that these common school routines like PLCs, building leadership teams and staff meetings and so on were leveraged as spaces for research use. So these became opportunities to introduce research into practice, to reinforce norms and expectations for research use, to support school-wide participation in research use, since everyone is engaged in at least some of these routines. And it has the effect of creating designated time for using research. Not all schools use routines in this way, but almost all schools have these routines, and therefore the potentially unrealized opportunity to use them to support engagement with research. Sorry about that. I didn't realize we had animation there. All right. So we're going to get interactive again, and we're going to turn it over to our other discussant, Lauren Supley, who will facilitate a discussion around the question, how can researchers, policymakers, and professional organizations work together to leverage schools and districts' capacity to engage with research? How can they work together and to ensure more equitable capacity for research use system-wide? And again, we're going to use that Jamboard. So if you would like to hop in there and comment, and Lauren, I'll invite you to facilitate this discussion.
Great, thank you so much. For those of you who I may not have yet had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Lauren Supley. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation, and I oversee our portfolio of research on the use of research evidence, and everything you've been hearing here today fits within that sort of in that portfolio, and how we want to study how and when we can increase the use of research evidence. And the really exciting thing for me is that everything you have heard so far has really aligned very nicely with overall findings from our portfolio for the last 12 years, which is really seeing that, you know, when research is used, when it's most relevant to the end users, so it's both timely and topically relevant, shared in the context of trusted relationships, and embedded in existing routines. So the data you just heard highlighted the potential untapped internal champions that would be those trusted relationships that might be internal sources that could act as that intermediary bridge. The data also highlighted looking at these existing routines, how and when and where research is used, and it can be naturally embedded within how schools are operating and how they're making decisions. And finally, the data are speaking to the overall culture of research use within the organization, which really aligned very nicely with the idea of absorptive capacity, which some of our grantees have been studying within school districts, which is really the ability of the district to support research use, facilitate internal communication about relevant research. It includes the internal routines, and the capabilities of assimilating new knowledge, applying external knowledge to a particular decision. And really, it comes down to leadership and infrastructure and leveraging those resources, as well as pulling in external resources when necessary. So I take away really optimism from these findings, that we can leverage these opportunities to make significant advances in improving how research is used in schools. So to answer that question directly posed, I am already seeing some great brainstorming of concrete ways we can identify those internal champions. So more inclusive definitions of research, and more ability to access the research, but also building those relationships, finding who are those internal champions that have that the ability to help and support their fellow teachers and leaders to really think about how that research applies. That collaborative approach to build that capacity in the district, and collaborating with faculty who maybe can also help build that internal capacity. Lots of themes of this sort of professional development. And, also it looks like sharing resources with staff so that they're aware that those might be accessible, whether that's open access articles and what we're Clearinghouse and other materials that can help facilitate those conversations. I love this offering more models of what research use might look like in reality, and not just the normative models. I think that's a great perspective. So I'm curious, as more ideas are popping up here for the research team, how much did you think about factors such as absorptive capacity when you were collecting this, or did that really just emerge as you were collecting the data?
I'll jump in. Certainly it was part of our thinking, particularly as we were working through the instrumentation for the CS survey. We have specific items in there to capture different aspects of organizational, absorptive capacity in particular, but organizational capacity more broadly. One thing that really comes out in the case studies is that leadership piece, which you referenced. And so when we think about sort of the unrealized capacity or more equitably distributed capacity, right, that leadership piece becomes really important. And so we also noticed that distributed leadership in schools also helps build capacity within the organization, right? So I think there's lots of implications here for thinking about that organizational level capacity building when we prepare leaders, right? Both at the district level and in the building level. And so that really came into it. But we were explicitly thinking about these frameworks. But this field, as this field is growing constantly, and there's new ideas and new ways of thinking about it all the time. And so we're excited to, now that we have all the data, to be linking it back to some of these ideas that have been in the discourse for a while.
And if I could follow up on that a little too, in the definition of leader. So at least, I've gone through a lot of leadership training in my professional career, and know that a leader doesn't mean that they have a title. A leader could be anyone at any level. They're seen as trusted, they're seen as knowledgeable, they're seen as somebody who might be that go-to resource. And I got the sense, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that some of your leaders were not necessarily the actual district leaders or principals. They were actually other individuals in the school. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about leadership and what it looked like.
Oh, there's so much there, Lauren. There's so much to unpack there. And actually, I think we'll hit a little bit on that in the key finding. But right, leader means many different things, right? That both the formal pieces, which is sort of expertise by already, but there's other people that have lots of expertise either by experience. We have lots of examples in our case studies of putting those, the third grade team that's in grade school together, right? That they're out there, they're centered in professional learning, they're sharing what they're getting from their professors, the latest and greatest research, or, an evidence-based practice, or things like that. And so leadership takes just so many forms. It's really actually hard to nail down. Now, I will say that formal leaders, like formal administrators, do play critically important roles. That's not to sort of suggest that, they're not important and these sort of informal leaders are. But it is sort of important to recognize that it's not only always immediately obvious who that influential person is, or that resource is, which also makes it challenging for us trying to work with schools or with districts, right? Is, okay, well, who is the person we need to talk to? Who's positioned to help, bring about better relationships between the research and practice community? So it's great and a challenge all at the same time.
It's also a really great segue, because the thing that basically popped into my head as you're asking that, it's like, it's all about brokerage. It's not about who's the formal leader, or it's about, essentially, if you're talking about research use specifically, it's about brokerage of research evidence, because people are not accessing it directly, and it's through professional networks that knowledge is mobilized. So we're going to hear a lot about these concepts actually when Samantha starts to talk about one of our next key findings.
Well, and before we make that transition, I just want to lift up one last sticky note I just saw that I love, which is thinking about, how do you incentivize research use and make it rewarded into regular practice? And I think that's really getting at thinking about the system and the infrastructure and the rewards within the system all the way through. So I love that comment. So with that, I will transition back over to you guys.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to kick off our third research finding here, or third key finding. And this is that most educators do not engage directly with research, right? We've sort of been talking about this, but rather that engagement is mediated through a wide range of individuals and organizations that serve as brokers. And on top of that, that system of brokers is largely informal and functions as an uncoordinated system in which research evidence is transformed and communicated. Debbie, I think we skipped a slide in there. Nope, we deleted a slide. Okay, in our survey, respondents indicated that our practitioner respondents indicated that they were interested in building connections with researchers, but don't always know how. And when we asked them, have they been in contact with a researcher, either has a researcher contacted them or have they reached out to a researcher, more than 90% in both said no, right? So there is this sort of disconnect. And so we know that this relationship is mediated. So going back to that network data that Katie sort of brought up in our last key finding, that network data showed that educators rely mostly on local sources such as teachers, principals, vice principals, instructional coaches. More than half of their networks were considered local in that way. And nearly the other half was intermediaries. So particularly professional associations, other web-based resources. And only 7% overall were resources that we would consider direct to research, right? Peer-reviewed journals, research databases, professors, research organizations, researchers, et cetera. So this makes intermediaries and school-based brokers critically important. So in this next slide, I'm going to share a little bit more about those school and district brokers. So they really operate in two ways. First, at left in this sociogram, we see that educators bring in new ideas. So that little blue dot at left with the gray arrow next to it is connected to all these other blue boxes. And those are external resources that person is connected to and that they're bringing into the school, right? So that's really one critical way that school-based brokers work. But they also work, as we see on the right-hand side, in moving those ideas around, right? So that blue, that little blue teacher there is sharing with some very important people in the school, the principal and assistant principal, who many educators go to for advice and resources. So brokerage works sort of within the organization and outside the organization. I'm also going to drop in a chat, a brief that we wrote about this that explains a little bit more about those ideas. So not only are they important in these ways, but we know a little bit now from our survey about the activities they engage in. So we see in the next slide at left that the school and district-based brokers engage in capacity building, right? So they help people access, interpret, use research. When we look at right, we see that they're engaged in particular activities that are, well, I would say very challenging for researchers to support or even intermediaries, right? So these are really low activities that school and district-based brokers are able to support. So this is sort of interesting when we think about how we leverage a system of brokerage to support research use, that these actors are really important. So I'm going to pass it over to Samantha to talk a little bit more about our broker study and the intermediary organizations in that space.
Thanks so much, Liz. So in the brokerage case studies, we found similar evidence of school and district-based staff engaging in brokering activities. So for example, in one case, we had a school-based occupational therapist, and she was being inundated with requests to support students in learning handwriting. Therefore, she decided to attend a state-based occupational therapy conference, and she attended a presentation that was on an evidence-based handwriting program. Then after the conference, she relied on her membership to a professional association in order to seek out and obtain more research-based information on handwriting, as well as specific evidence in support of the program itself. She then transformed the conference materials and other research-based information she obtained by summarizing and synthesizing the resources and turning them into professional learning materials that she then shared with her occupational therapist colleagues within the district. And then she also raised awareness and promoted the use of the evidence-based handwriting program by providing classroom demonstrations to teachers to show them how to implement the program within their own classrooms. Next slide, please. So intermediary organizations, on the other hand, largely acted as conduits of information, with researchers pushing research-based products to intermediary organizations, and then practitioners pulling products from a wide range of organizations and reconciling the information for school and district use. Our findings suggest that the success of these cases was dependent on researchers and practitioners as drivers, which historically has not led to systematic uptake of research in practice. We also found limited evidence of strategic coordination among intermediary organizations to mobilize research. Although the collective efforts of actors were ultimately successful in our cases, we find an element of serendipity in how the various intermediaries function to create a path from research to practice. So if the work of these intermediaries was intentionally coordinated, we might, oh, you went too far. If the work of these intermediaries was intentionally coordinated, we might expect to see educators reporting common approaches to finding research or common organizations to which they turn. However, our data really suggests that the system of brokerage is largely informal and uncoordinated. So for example, our survey respondents mentioned more than 4,000 unique organizations and media sources as a source of information. Further, in our study of brokerage, we see that these intermediary roles taken up to fill a perceived gap between research and practice. The diversity we observed here has both advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, for every specific need, there's likely a resource tailored to it. However, on the other hand, the emergence of so many actors in this space suggests that knowledge needs are not being met systematically. In other words, the infrastructure supporting educators' access to research is inadequate to their needs. So rather, we see research making many stops along the way, with the path between research and practice not a simple A to B to C link, but often a complicated serendipitous pathway. And all of this suggests the need to consider ways to better organize and leverage the system of brokerage in education. Next slide, please. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to lead us in a group discussion regarding how we can formalize the role of systematically engaged with and support intermediaries and other brokers.
Great, thank you so much, Samantha. So again, go back to that Jamboard and start putting your ideas. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share a few of my thoughts when I saw these slides. So, we often talk about in order for research to be more likely to be used, it has to be more useful to end users. I had just, mentioned that in the last section. And we often have a conversation then steered towards the direction of research practice partnerships as a tool towards this. And they certainly can be, but they may not be the only way to do that. So sometimes research practice partnerships might serve in this intermediary or broker role, but sometimes not. But I think that if we think differently about intermediaries, whether that's within an RPP or outside of it, we open up lots of opportunities for research to inform practice. So, as we've already talked about, local champions within schools might be ripe opportunities to share information. And it might be identifying one of those individuals, building that relationship and being that resource for them. But at the same time, I often hear from academic researchers that you have a million different things happening and you may not have the time to really build individual relationships with people across multiple districts. And so one way to think about this also, as we just heard, is who are the other intermediary organizations, the professional associations, and the technical assistance providers, that they actually might have a wider reach, and they're often they're paid to develop those trusted relationships. They're given training on how to make that research more relevant to the end user. And they often have a pulse on when that research might be most useful to the end user. So thinking about researchers, really more critically identifying who are key intermediaries or brokers in that space in their field, and then how can you maybe build a more trusted relationship with them to maybe influence and increase the impact of your research. Of course, the challenge that we also just heard is that the field of intermediary and brokers is not very well codified. And I actually remember in one of the CRUE meetings last year, I think someone said, who is brokering the brokers? There is no coordinating force. And so I think it's still a bit of a, a hodgepodge to think about, how do you best identify who is that organization, who is both doing quality work, who has the pipeline to the individuals with the skills and expertise that you want to tap into, who is seen as most trusted. So as you're putting in the chats, or in the Jamboard, thinking about how do we formalize the system, how as a researcher can you most effectively leverage this system of brokers and intermediaries. So I see a question already. How can we help educators and policymakers identify intermediaries that are good? And help. We need to find opportunities for researchers at state practitioner conferences and events. I like that. When I have conversations with pre-doctoral folks who are interested in non-academic careers, I often say now's the time to maybe start building relationships with local organizations and start to learn how to translate that knowledge and build that trusted relationship. Somebody commented that we need to coordinate all of these under an umbrella organization. I think that's a great idea, though probably a very large task. But I think that could potentially really help. I also love identify the training that brokers need to build that process. I think there's a large conversation happening in the field right now on, what are the skills that brokers need? How do you build a pipeline of brokers as a field? And I guess a question I would also love to pose maybe to Liz and Henry and others on the team, what is the role of universities in building the capacity for individuals to serve in these roles?
I think that's a critical question, right? And Lauren referenced earlier last January, CRUE hosted something called the Research Broker Network meeting, and it brought together intermediaries, about 85 people from different intermediaries, different sectors, research intermediary kinds of folks, practice intermediary folks, and all of these issues that Lauren brought up are what they centered on, right? We don't know who each other are, how to work together. There's not a clear professional training, professional pathway. We're not sure how to do this work. Sometimes they're isolated in the larger organization which they work because they're, that organization has many different activities and functions. So I think there's a really big opportunity for folks to be thinking about how we prepare those folks. And there's actually some initiatives underway in that space. And we're working on a piece related to sort of co-designing research-based products. There's some folks like Paul Arstragati, Caitlin Farrell that are working on thinking about how you prepare brokers to work in the context of research practice partnerships. I think there's another one with Carnegie. So this space, I think, is growing, and there's greater recognition of that work, but it really is daunting. You know, when we said there was more than 4,000 unique organizations mentioned, we weren't kidding, right? Like, that's a lot, right? And that's a lot of people operating in the space. And so to think about how to streamline that, organize it, coordinate it is no small task.
Yeah, for sure. And I see also someone put down here, I know some schools have started to offer coursework in graduate school and research practice partnerships, and hopefully that's also building very similar capacities. All right, well, I will hand the mic then back to the team for the last topic for us today.
Thanks, Lauren. So our fourth and final key finding. Debbie. Sorry,
It's
just waiting for the PowerPoint. Okay, so our fourth and final key finding is that when school-based educators do engage with external research, they tend not to engage with traditional research products. And research is also ultimately adapted by educators and incorporated into locally developed resources, tools, and routines. So we'll start out by looking at some of the data from the survey. So this horizontal bar chart shows that respondents more often tended to use professional resources, such as professional development materials and other media, such as books. Research projects and their products, like peer-reviewed journal articles or research and program evaluation reports, were used less often. Professional resources, such as professional development materials and conference presentations, were considerably more prevalent. And respondents took advantage of those practice-oriented resources more often than research products. So when we look at case studies, we find similar findings. So looking at the products used in case study schools, books featured heavily as resources. Numerous book titles were mentioned in the case study interviews, including Hacking School Discipline, Grading from the Inside Out, and Other People's Children, just to name a few. As we know, teachers have a very limited time and books are usually pretty long, but book studies were frequently used and seen as a helpful way to break down longer resources into usable pieces, as this quote on this slide demonstrates. Articles were frequently referenced as well, but usually much more generally, with few examples of where those articles came from. So vague comments like, we read articles and stuff like that, or we all read this article on virtual learning that was good, were made, but usually without any more detail. The few specific article sources that were mentioned include the American Pediatric Association, Ed Leadership, and Ed Week. Professional development and conference attendance were also important activities. So for example, in decision-making process surrounding the adoption of a new ELA curriculum, after a committee narrowed down the options, a group of teachers attended a week-long training to learn more about one program of interest. One educator explained the reason for this as being, we wanted to experience it firsthand. We wanted to watch the teachers in action and watch the kids and see if it was working for them. Watching it in action at another school was the thing that made us decide, yes, sure, this is what we want. Conferences and presumably but implicitly their presentations and associated materials became products in which evidence was packaged. So interviewees mentioned learning about different resources through conferences. For example, a teacher describes learning about a new book from the Harris Conference. In another school, an educator learned about the Bookworms reading program at a conference and ultimately brought that back to her school where it was adopted. Often research, when asked about what research use looks like, or to provide an example of research use or an example of what research was used, educators often mention programs or curricula themselves, equating evidence use with the use of evidence-based practices. Responses like the quotes that you see on the screen, were very common. Programs such as PBIS, Eureka Math, Orton Gilliam, System 44 are just a few of the programs that are mentioned in this way. Credible experts were also mentioned. These might ultimately be brokers, but rather than mentioning a product like a book, the evidence was described as Hattie's research. Frameworks and models like the Fontes and Pinnell framework or Jim Knight's model were also cited. And then when we look at the preferences around the characteristics of products, we also learned a great deal about that from our case studies. So overall, the most important characteristic mentioned across the cases is that products are written for a practitioner audience. So they should be understandable and concise, and specifically, practitioners want products that are actionable and provide steps to take in the classroom, as the second quote here demonstrates. So now I'll turn it over to Samantha, who has some further insights from the brokerage study.
Thanks, Katie. So in the brokerage case studies, we were also interested in exploring the characteristics of the different products found within each case. So we explored characteristics like product type and format, and our findings align with the findings just presented by my colleague, Katie. Namely, practitioners preferred products that were developed by and for educators. And across our cases, we found several different types of research-based products that were used by educators, such as books, professional learning resources, and videos. We additionally explored whether products were prescriptive or descriptive in nature. We described descriptive as products that simply report on something, while we defined resources as prescriptive if they told people what they should do or how to do it, rather than simply describing what was done. For example, in one case study that I had referred to earlier, a school-based occupational therapist attended a conference presentation on an evidence-based handwriting program. We categorized the conference presentation and materials as descriptive because the focus of the presentation was on describing the program and the research evidence behind it. Afterwards, the occupational therapist provided a classroom demonstration to teachers to show them how to integrate the program into their everyday practice. And we classified this demonstration as being prescriptive in nature because she showed classroom teachers how to implement the evidence-based program. So while we found that educators prefer to use books and other practitioner-friendly resources over traditional academic publications, we also found that these practitioner-friendly resources were research-based, with traditional academic publications undergoing sometimes several transformations, becoming different types of research-based resources as they made their way into practice. For example, in one case, we see that research findings were summarized into a book. The book was then summarized and synthesized with other resources to create a school handbook. And then it was this handbook that ultimately was used by school staff to guide school improvement efforts. So before turning it over to Norma to lead us in a final discussion, I want to draw your attention to the quote at the top of the slide. One education researcher who requested to remain anonymous said, "We all think that we write these great implication sections, but it's all just garbage." We'd like you to keep this quote in mind as Norma leads us in a discussion around 3 questions that focus on transforming traditional research products into actionable and usable resources for educators. Take it away, Norma.
There's just so much in all of these questions. I'm not even going to touch the quote. So I find it really interesting to reflect on what it means for research to be actionable in the context of your presentation, because you're actually doing that right now. You are looking for a way to make your own research actionable. And I really appreciate that. And I think it's interesting for all of the participants to reflect on, what does that mean for your own research that you conduct? What do you need to do to make it actionable? And I think another important theme in here is the aspect of engagement. And so I want to look at this a little bit more, because there's an interesting tension if we think about your results about the value that practitioners have in books. And this feels very familiar to me. All of your findings feel familiar, both because of having read your previous research and because of my own experience, just what I observe in my own work with my own colleagues. And it feels a little paradoxical. Why do practitioners prefer books when everybody says they don't have time? And so this is something to be unpacked a little bit more empirically. But it is interesting for me to notice that there's a certain commonality in terms of the books, the professional development experiences, the examples. And I wonder about looking into this a little bit more about depth of engagement. It's not so much about the dissemination. When people think about dissemination, it's about getting a single nugget of information spread broadly. But it seems as if potentially practitioners might be looking for something where they can engage more deeply in it. And so I think that's something for us to consider. With regard to making research actionable, I'm interested in what the audience sees as how they would define that. I think your findings speak to that a little bit. Prescriptive, what do you actually do, as opposed to, oh, this is interesting, I'm describing something and I wonder about that. I also wonder from your perspective and what you've observed, what is it that is necessary in terms of putting in the supports for people to produce actionable research? Because we have to start with the definition. What does that mean for it to be actionable? But then we have to make that actionable. How do you create actionable research? And so maybe I'll, you know what, I not yet, because you've got a lot on here. I'm going to go through all of them, and then you can decide which questions you most want to respond to. So that is about the actionable part. I spoke a little bit to the cost benefit trade-offs, and I think that's part of what we're discussing here. So there's the cost benefit trade-offs of producing the research, and then there's cost benefit trade-offs of using the research. Those second set of trade-offs are very salient to me, because I know that it is extremely costly to demand my colleagues' time to pay attention to a single piece of data or a single piece of research. How do we maximize the benefit that they get from that? And then on the flip side, for people who are producing research and you believe it is worth using, what is it that you can do to maximize the benefit that they get out of it and minimize the cost? And again, there's that tension because they want to spend more time, but if they're going to spend all that time, you have to make sure it's worthwhile. So with regard to those trade-offs, I hear that as something that you're discussing with regard to the transformation of the research products. And so I wonder to what extent transforming research products is just a matter of packaging or delivering the same information in a more accessible manner. So you've got your research product and you just have to communicate it better. But to what extent do you actually have to add new information? Because if people are looking for cases or practical examples, you can't just make something up. You have to make sure there's an empirical basis behind that. And so now that has implications that it's not just communication, it's actually how you conduct the research, or maybe it's after you conduct the research, you engage with practitioners to have them describe what the case might look like. And then you have to decide based on the theory that you've just tested and the other evidence that you have, is that valid? And so that's again collecting more information, whether you frame it as research or not. So I'm wondering to what extent you might think of transformation as communication as opposed to additional research. And then about the relationship between communication, dissemination, and engagement, I'm wondering about what the nature of the processes are and who are the people. And so there's quite a bit of research that I would love to know more about in dissemination science. And your brokerage studies start to get at this, where you're distinguishing between the different roles. And so you have to think about the audience, and then you think about the message that is appropriate for them. And then you think about the channel by which that message reaches that audience. And I find it really interesting that you're doing both, looking more narrowly within the system about the different roles within the system and how the kind of research they might be using, the kind of data they're looking at, as well as the actors outside in terms of all of the other brokers outside of the system. And so I wonder about how to examine that a little bit more deeply. And then I think this might be next to last point, sorry. We're talking about just to get research used. And I understand from the perspective of researchers, it may seem like, if I could just get the research used, that's all I want. I think that's a little bit of a low bar. And so when I talk about measuring actions, I think about, well, was it done at all? And then how much was it done? And then how well was it done? Getting back to the benefits, because if any of us is going to ask practitioners and leaders to invest that much time, it had better be worthwhile. And it can't just be, oh yes, I used research. Did you use the research well? What does that mean? And how do you support that? Because if they didn't use it well, maybe it wasn't worth their time. And I guess that kind of touches upon how do we, not just how do we learn whether they're using research, but how do we learn whether they're using research well? And that could be about validity, it could be about impact. So I'll pause to let you answer any of those many questions.
Who wants to go first?
You can go for it.
All right, so a little anecdote from way back when. So I was actually, I had the pleasure to attend a ceremony for a graduating class of IES predoctoral fellows about 15 years ago, one of the first classes of IES predoctoral fellows. And Russ Whitehurst was in attendance. And so you guys might recall Russ was the original director of IES when it was created. He started as a director of OERI. And then when the Education Sciences Reform Act was passed, he became director of IES. He described how, as the impetus for IES was sort of in process, he had visited a number of school leaders and district leaders in various states and just asked them, what should the Federal Department of Education be doing in terms of research? What do you want to know? And they kept asking him questions about what works. And this is where the what works concept started driving IES. And when you think about it, yeah, practitioners are constantly faced with, okay, we have a problem here. We've got to figure out some solution to this problem. And then we've got to implement that, right? And so the model that ended up coming out of that, and that undergirds a lot of what IES does even to today, is figuring out what are the malleable factors that can improve outcomes, developing interventions to address problems and improve practices, and then testing those interventions in randomized trials or quasi-experiments to determine their impacts, and then in some ways, sort of scaling them up or testing them at scale, testing them in replication studies and so on. And so that implies that the process for research use is sort of inherently instrumental, right? One form of research use is instrumental research use, where research is used to help inform a decision. But there are other ways in which research can be used. For example, conceptual use of research, where people are perhaps reading books and then it changes the way they think about learning and instruction. But it doesn't necessarily lead them to adopt a different program per se, right? So in that sense, I think that one of the things that should happen is that we have to think more broadly about the ways in which educators can engage with research, but then also to sort of recognize that the nature of the research that perhaps gets published through IES funding, ends up in What Works Clearinghouse, it's not necessarily going to address all of the questions that are facing educators. And so we've got to have a way for our two communities to be a bit more nimble in the way that they collaborate. And so that's why one of the things that I'd like to see is increased local capacity to do and engage with research, specifically hiring all those research directors in every school district across the country. And then also to inspire and incentivize connections with between researchers and the practitioner community. All right, I'm going to stop there and let others talk.
And I want to invite Katie and Samantha also to contribute, because you guys are deep in the weeds here, and Henry and I tend to talk. So I just want to go back to one point that Norma made, which is sort of that there's an opportunity cost, right? So if folks are going to be using research, it's got to be worth their time, right? And for researchers to go that extra length to make it actionable or go through the process of like development associated with their research, it's got to be worth their time. And I think those, to the earlier point, Lauren, about incentives, right? Those incentive structures are not particularly well aligned, right? So, seeing the value in using research and making it worth their time is hard to guarantee, right? And so it's hard to know when it's worth your time. Interestingly, I was writing some of our results this morning. One of the ways that some of the educators in our deep use schools said that they knew the research they were using was good was because they got good results when they implemented those programs. Right. And so it's sort of this confirmatory thing. So I think that's actually a really nice example of when using research was worth their time, because they got great results. But that's how to sort of understand that is I don't know that we have a good answer for that. And it's certainly worth thinking about. I do think we have long, as a community, been talking about some of the challenges for the incentive structure for research, right? And so how we think about those not just dissemination or communication, but also additional translation, the development part of research and development, right? That's not always part of research trajectories. And so I think that's, if we can think about ways of incentivizing or building capacity for that, that might push us closer together, like pushing into that actionability space. Again, I agree, we have to sort of define that better, but I think those are some interesting things for all of us collectively to be thinking about. And Corinne just dropped into the chat a cue that we are in like wrap up mode with our time here. So I think, if anyone has questions, please drop them into the chat. I know that we would love to hear from any of you. We'd love to talk with any of you about our findings or share these in another format. You can always access our website through researchforschools.org. Sorry. Or I'm going to let someone else finish up while my dog
That's
has
a barking endorsement. There's our contact info. And I'm not on Twitter because I have a big mouth, but we do have a Twitter handle, and feel free to tweet at us or retweet or so on. We appreciate it.
And we also really appreciate the engagement that you it's as soon as I start talking, she barks. That you guys offered in the jam boards. This has been so provocative and so so helpful to us, and hopefully to all of you as well. So please stay in touch, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone from CRUE.
Absolutely. And there'll be more to come.
Yes, stay tuned for findings coming out in lots of different ways and venues.
Yeah, I feel like after this project, we'll be swimming in data for the next, for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
Which is, I've been trying to make a plug that our Officer Research Awards are great for secondary data analysis.
I'm all over it, Lauren.
Yeah,
And that's also an offer of collaboration for those of you interested in some of this work as well. So please reach out on that.
Oh, and anybody that's interested in using any component of our survey should also feel free to reach out. It's copyrighted under a, what's it called?
Creative Commons.
Creative Commons license. Exactly. So
and
you guys are
uploaded
welcome to share it. You're just not allowed to make any money off of it.
And will be uploaded into the URE methods repository, I'm sure.
Yes, we've been in contact with Drew, and he's been hounding us every so often saying, is that tech report ready? So it'll be coming shortly. Actually, we might hold him to being a reviewer on it, an external reviewer, in order to to give it to him.
And of course, we'd be remiss without thanking Lauren and Norma for their time and, thoughts and contributions to this work and this conversation, and of course, beyond today. So thank you guys.
No, thank you so much for including me. I love learning from all of you. So this is just a wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. It is a little ironic, though, that when we present these results to folks like you that actually work in school districts, like, well, yeah, of course, you needed a survey to show that. We already knew this. But you know how it is. In God we trust, all others bring data.
Especially for a community that is always looking for the data.
Yeah.
All right. And on that note, I think the Padlets are going to stay active. So, folks want to continue to comment, they can. But we look forward to seeing you guys in other venues.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have
Thank
a good
you
evening.
So much. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.